Hello and welcome. In today's video, I'm going to share with you Ark's 5 best tanks. And just before we get into it, make sure to like and subscribe as it really helps the channel. In at number 5 is the Gasbags. Now, if you haven't played Ark before, you may not expect this thing to be an absolute tank beast, considering how cute and fluffy it looks. But actually, the reason why it is such a good tank is actually that fluffiness. The gas that it creates is the reason why this thing is a great tank. Once it inhales the air, it has an insane amount of damage and torpor reduction, which makes it really good for doing any kind of tanking, as damage reduction is the main thing that you're looking for, as turrets do an insane amount of damage, and you need to compensate for that with buffs like damage reduction and obviously a high health stat. If you did want more gas to fly around though, you will level up stamina, but if you are creating a tank here, you're definitely just really going to be leveling health and maybe a little bit into melee, but the Gasbags really isn't putting up a fight in the melee department. Also, if you are trying to control this thing to get this thing around, it is a bit of a pain until you actually know how to control it. And when I was recording the B-roll for this video, I was not controlling the Gasbags well at all. My controlling for this thing is absolutely rubbish. I'm still terrible at it, but I'm sure once you put a bit of practice into it, it will be fine. It's actually quite similar to the Maywing. When Genesis Part 2 first came out, I was really bad at controlling the Maywing, but I actually ended up not being too bad at it after a couple hours of practice. And yes, you can see here, I definitely needed a couple of extra hours of practice. But the thing is, that doesn't really matter if you're using it as a tank. You're just going to be cryopoding it out and then simply sending it in to the fields of turrets and then healing it up again with something like a Daedon or a Snow Owl. I actually ended up so out of control that I was above the map. If I was on a different map, I probably could have easily died here. Also, be careful of fall damage. In at number 4 is the Carb Enemies. Now, you probably definitely expected this thing to be on the list, but you may ask, why is this higher than the Gasbags? And that's partly because it is a lot more accessible and easier to tame than the Gasbags. The Gasbags is also locked behind a paywall, which is extinction. Obviously, every Ark creature is behind a paywall because the game itself costs money. But if you just buy Ark by itself, you will get the Carb Enemies, but you will not get access to the Gasbags. Also, the Carb Enemies is actually an insanely good tank. This thing actually does have a little bit more damage reduction and torpor reduction than something like the Gasbags, and it doesn't rely on the gas being inflated as well. That is all of the time. Also, the Carb Enemies is a lot more easy to transport than the Gasbags, as I can actually control this thing. I still can't control the Gasbags, no matter how much I try, but the Carb Enemies is really simple. And also, if you're doing any kind of raiding of underwater caves as well, these things aren't a bad option, as these things are actually good swimmers, and they don't even have an oxygen stat, so these things aren't going to drown underwater. Also, don't use these things for any kind of combat, as they're not really going to stack up in any way. These are not fighting creatures, these are simply tanks for draining turrets. But you're probably here for tanks and not for fighting creatures, so I don't know why I said that. But I feel like someone is just going to go out there and just send this into a battlefield in a raid. Please do not do that. It is not going to work at all. In at number 3 is the Stego. Now, this is by far one of the most invested tanks in Ark. This thing really has been coded into the game to be a tank after the TLC update came out, as this thing has 3 types of plates now. It has the sharpened plate, which is great for dealing melee damage and berry harvesting. Then it has the hardened plate, which is what you will use for doing any kind of turret soaking. And there is also, on top of that, the heavy plate, which is good for harvesting things like wood. So if you're in the strange situation when you were doing some turret soaking and you wanted to harvest wood, you could switch over and harvest some wood, or maybe switch over to the sharpened plate and harvest berries. Either way, in the kind of turret soaking scenario, you are going to be using the hardened plate for all of your endeavors. And also, these things do have a special ability which no other tank on this list has. It has protection for the rider as well, which means when the turret hits, you are going to have some damage reduction on your player as well, which means you are much less likely to actually be killed in a raid scenario. But don't raid bases underwater with a Stego. These things are the slowest on land, and they're even slower in water. Don't even try to attempt that. These are mainly for land raids only, and they really do excel at it. In at number 2 is the Reaper. Now, you may not think that these are absolutely fantastic tanks, but you would be wrong. These things are absolutely insane tank creatures, and these things are really great for turret soaking. Also, the keen-eyed among you may realize this is a Reaper Queen and not a Reaper King. You are going to be using a Reaper King. You can't tame Reaper Queens, it's just I force tamed one for the use of B-roll here, as I couldn't be bothered to type in a command to spawn the Reaper King because I spawned right next to a Reaper Queen. Also, since the launch of Genesis Part 2, these things haven't been easier to tame, and Roz Clark actually does have a really good guide on how to tame these things really quickly. They can even be your first tame on Genesis Part 2, as they don't even need a saddle for you to ride it. They just are a bit of a pain to tame if you don't know what you're doing. But apart from soaking, these things also deal an insane amount of melee damage, which means you can quickly escape from any situation. It's just I didn't escape from this one quick enough, as I ended with about 7 Reapers all over me. Luckily, I did still manage to escape though, as these things are very quick and agile. These things are definitely not slow creatures and can get out of any difficult scenario. And finally, in at number 1 is the Golem. You definitely expected this thing to be on the list if you clicked on a top 5 Ark Tanks video. You can already tell how much of a tank this thing is just simply by its appearance. It is literally a big hunk of rocks, and yes, it definitely does take to the fullest that damage reduction ability. Just sadly, unlike the Stego, there is still no protection for the rider. Also, sorry about the saddle not being on the Rock Golem at the time of the B-roll. You're just going to have to deal with my slightly floaty player character. And you can also really see how much damage these things do by how quickly I absolutely decimated this Deathworm. If you didn't know, Deathworms are absolutely insane beasts, which are known for being very tough to kill. And the fact that I kill one in about 10 seconds really does show the Rock Golem's power. But this thing definitely is a very difficult tame, and you should not underestimate it. You tame this thing by literally shooting cannons at this thing's face, and then once it's knocked out, it is pretty simple. Just feed it stones or sulfur. And give it up for our patrons, Ekaterina Puchkova and Karina Thorne, Dominic Maciejewski, sorry about that name, and everyone else that's on this list. All the people I've mentioned are paid members, and if you feel like that's something you want a shout out at the end of the video, go join the Patreon or become a paid YouTube member.